What we see here is both the extractivism and the exploitation that a capitalist green transition necessarily contains.
We love the fact that you love freedom.
Welcome to another episode of our series. Today we talk about the oldest Swedish anarchist magazine and the ways in which the magazine connects with the local political struggle. Brand is a leftist, anti-authoritarian quarterly magazine in Swedish, in print since 1898. Each issue of the magazine is centered around a different subject, generally focusing on activism, social movements, political theory and debate, containing essays, interviews, poems, comics and illustrations. It has no affiliation to any political party or organization. The English translation of the name's magazine, Brand, is fire or wildfire.
Viktor Mauritz is a member of the editorial collective Brand and is here with us today. Welcome, Viktor.
Thank you so much.
Tell us for the beginning, what is the role of Brand magazine in the political context of Sweden? What is the readership? And tell us if there are any principles that the magazine follows.
Yes, so I guess our readers are mainly, leftists, feminists, activists, people affiliated with radical social movements of different kinds. As you said, Ovid, it's not affiliated to any specific organization or party, but it's based on, let's say, unpaid volunteer work, which is part of, or maintaining political independence, but it's also a way of ensuring that we stay connected as an editorial collective with different parts of political movements. So while the collective itself doesn't have affiliations, of course, each of the members are involved in different sorts of politics.
But was the political involvement of the magazine locally or transnationally?
I think we collaborate with a multitude of movements. We collaborate with different organizations around events and things connected to the topics we cover. But we also sometimes have let's say guest editors, or have organizations step in as guest editors for specific issues. So for instance, collectives from the migrant solidarity movement has edited one issue, an anti-fascist organization edited another issue a while ago. So this is a type of affiliate collaborations we can have.
Victor, currently with the escalation of the war in Ukraine, there is a new kind of pressure exerted on magazines with radical emancipatory content, such as Brand. Can you tell us more about it?
I think like more mainstream leftist publications are under more severe press, and I think in Sweden this has been even more noticeable over the past year, since 7th October last year, the Palestinian attack on Israel, and then of course the Israeli aggression in Gaza, with more pressure, I think, on these issues. But I think for us, it's not something we feel so affected by. What we are more affected by was a collaboration we had with Russian publication from before the invasion, which was made almost impossible since the invasion, because of international restrictions on economic transactions and stuff like that with Russia, but also because of repression in Russia against anybody collaborating with actors in Western Europe. So I think this is how we've noticed this most concretely.
The contributors often talk in the magazine Brand about the paralyzing effects of financial capitalism, which has fragmented the working class and undermined the power of the workers, both in Sweden and globally. What can a political magazine do to tackle these effects beyond raising awareness? Or is raising awareness the main task?
I think you can talk about raising awareness in two different ways. I think one thing is raising awareness about the issues of finance capitalism and how it affects people in their lives and so on. And I think this has severe limitations. And I think what we try to do often is to raise awareness of, methods of struggle, of forms of political action. And I think this maybe is a more politically productive line of action, let's say, or mode of operation for a publication like ours. I think also there's some, when we think about like you said, the fragmentation of workers, I think there's always a risk in the critique of financial capitalism of nostalgia. And I think for us, I think it's important to sort of reject nostalgia for like a previous Fordist paradigm, which was also, of course, very authoritarian, with the factory discipline, corporatist trade union leaderships playing a big part in repression of workers, for instance. And of course, I think this is also an epoch that was ended by worker struggles, all over the world in the 60s and 70s. I think was the death blow to this paradigm. So when we, I think this is an important aspect of discussing like the vicissitudes of finance capital today.
Talking about risks, in the Romanian context, we see the risk of commodification of the left. In other words, we see how leftist ideas are being commodified and become some sort of lifestyle. Is Brand facing the same risk of becoming another subculture, be it an anti-capitalist one?
Right. I think like the current editorial collective has a continuity since 2010, of course, with individuals shifting over that time, but there was a period before with a different editorial collective, we can say. And I think one of the things we wanted, or that the editorial collective then wanted in 2010, I wasn't participating myself, but I think that was trying to move away from the subculture, let's say, or expressions of more of a subculture of political activism, and have like a broader appeal, both in terms of layout, aesthetics of the magazine, but also of content, right? To have more of a broader appeal. But I think also at the same time, when we talk about trying to have a more broad appeal, there's also the risk of becoming more conformist, right? With capitalist society, mainstream society. And I think sometimes can be productive. Maybe it's something we've tried to do, is to think when we talk about lifestyle, maybe what we talk about more is consumption, right? Whereas we can also talk about life forms, or how we will try to live, as more of a political practice of, social commons or community is in confrontation with capital or with racism or whatever. So I think there's a line to be walked there, if that makes sense.
Definitely. Well, one slogan that drew our attention in the magazine was the refusal to work. So this idea pops out often in the Brand articles. A liberating attitude of the working class is to get rid of the traditional model of celebrating labor, especially waged labor. Still, the most organized form of labor refusal is a strike. Do you know of any recent labor refusals that occurred in Sweden?
I mean, first of all, I think you're very right to point out that this is an important topic for us, and I think this also goes back to what I said before about the magazine being entirely based on unpaid labor, right? We don't want Brand to be a product of work, of salaried work, right, of wage labor. So I think this is an example of that sort of refusal, I suppose. In Sweden, I mean, if you go way back to like the formation of the Swedish welfare state, of course, which is, I suppose, famous internationally, we had one of the most combative working classes and one of the most conflictual labor markets in all of Europe. But during the post-war era, and especially since the 1980s, this really has changed. And I would say that the Swedish labor market today is in many ways suffocated by very, very like corporativist ideologies, completely characterizing the big working class trade unions, such as Kommunal or IF Metall, which are like some of the biggest trade unions in Sweden, and repeatedly side with the bosses, side with the employers in any kind of conflict situation. We have this example of the rank and file dock workers union. We also have an anarcho-syndicalist or syndicalist trade union, which in most sectors does not have such a significant presence, but among migrant workers in the construction sector and in sanitation sector, for instance, has pretty important organizing, especially in the Stockholm area, and which has been very combative if you think about the past years. And then another sort of refusal of work that we've seen in a pretty big scale in Sweden over the past years has been like public sector employees in confrontation with the government around proposed legislation that public sector employees have to turn in or like notify border police or the migration agency when they come in contact with undocumented migrants or people without a residence permit. And there has been pretty large-scale campaigns where thousands and thousands of healthcare workers, for example, have pledged each individually never to turn in an undocumented migrant, regardless of any proposed legislation. So it's not a strike, but it's a refusal of some of the tasks that the right-wing government want to impose as part of changing the nature of the work from healthcare work to as a form of border policing.
Four perfectly healthy workers who all worked in the same chemical industrial plant which manufactures electric car batteries, owned by Volkswagen, BMW, Goldman Sachs and others, died inexplicably. You write about this in your last article, IF Metall Against Workers' Lives. Give us a short context of the labor struggle at Northvolt and the labor struggle in general that is put under pressure by the infrastructure of the so-called green transition.
Right. So what happened in the Northvolt factory, I mean, this is one of Northvolt's factories around the world, but it's the first one they built and the first one that is up and running. It opened a couple of years ago in Skellefteå, which is a city in the north of Sweden. And the reason it opens there specifically is because there's a municipal electric company, like electricity company, energy company, I suppose you say in English, that is operating hydropower plants that are municipally owned. And so they offer pretty generous conditions for opening this power plant powered by this hydropower, which is, of course, green in the sense that there's it's hydropower, it's not carbon. It's not carbon. Yeah, we see an image now. One of the hydropower plants owned by this corporation, and so it's branded, as if they produce batteries for electric cars as green technology, basically. And I think what we've seen in Northvolt is these 4 cases of inexplicable deaths by workers. They are all previously healthy and suddenly died for no apparent reason, and as there have been medical assessments into causes of death, they have not been able to be determined. And of course, this raises suspicion that it's some form of intoxication related to their workplace, as this is a highly environment characterized by different forms of dangerous chemicals. What drove me to write this article was the attitude of the main trade union, or the trade union that has a collective bargaining agreement with Northvolt for these industrial workers, which is IF Metall. And we see the chairperson of EF Metal nationally in this picture. And what they have done is, consequently denying that there is any connection between these things, like the deaths and the workplace environment, and have been over and over again, criticizing media for reporting about this. They have been criticizing subcontractors for not sending their staff in as they're worried about their staff's health. So they have really been, disregarding any possible health risks for the workers in the factory. And I think this is, a very strong example of the corporativism characterizing the big Swedish industrial trade unions. And I think it highlights a need for organizing migrant workers in particular, as 3 of these 4 workers are migrant workers that have moved to Skellefteå to work in this factory from other countries. And also, of course, of the need to challenge these, official establishment trade unions. And I think also it's a good example of what we can call the underbelly of the green transition. And I think in particular in the north of Sweden, this is something that's been discussed quite a bit, as the north of Sweden is more scarcely populated, even though there, of course, is population, including indigenous population, which has been historically subjugated and treated very badly by the Swedish state. And what we see now is a lot of extractivism of different kinds related to the need for the so-called green transition, in terms of new mines opening for different forms of minerals that are needed in these new technologies, as well as large scale projects trying to extract energy from the north of Sweden in terms of increasing hydropower production, but also wind power. And of course, in these more scarcely populated places, sometimes there can be like very, very, very significant wind power projects, which are controversial among some of the local populations, as they feel disproportionately affected by this green transition, let's say.
Right, and we
so
can
I think what we see here is both the extractivism and the exploitation that a capitalist green transition necessarily contains, right? So I think it highlights the need for challenging this capitalist form of decarbonizing.
Give us an image on the differences that are from north to south. What are the differences and similarities between the use of labor force in this recent process of industrial expansion in the north of Sweden and the use of migrant labor force in the southern cities? Give us some examples of the forms of exploitation, control, intimidation if it happens, harassment, pushbacks, and so on and so forth.
Right. So migrant labor is, of course, especially in the south of Sweden, it's concentrated to some sectors. And of course, there are 2 forms of migrant labor as well, right? We have the official migrant workers that are coming in here, with a work permit to begin with, and are working, under Swedish labor laws. And we have the undocumented migrants. Of course, these blend together, and this is something we see a lot in specifically some sectors, for instance, construction sector. And I think if we talk about the construction sector, I think we see a lot of similarities all over Sweden, whether it's the north or the south, with, workers' rights being more or less completely ignored. These conditions are often denied by official both like state authorities as well as official trade unions, or like majority trade unions. And of course, these workers are criminalized in different ways. So there's actually not, even though they formally have some legal rights, even undocumented workers, there's not really anybody protecting those legal rights, apart from, like the syndicalist trade union, for example, which is the exception to the rule there. And of course, like often this migrant labor is organized by criminal networks, right? So really like the criminal capitalists, let's say, and of course associated with just physical violence and threats of physical violence as a pretty widespread method of repression of workers, right? So it's pretty common even for people to have an official work permit organized through these networks, coming here with an official contract for working, but then just not getting paid and getting threatened with physical violence if they try to claim their payment. So this is something that is very systematic, and of course these small companies run by the criminal organizations, they are subcontractors for the big official construction companies. There are 4 construction companies that completely dominate the whole Swedish construction sector, and they all use this form of labor.
What sector of constructions?
The construction sector.
In
construction
civil constructions or industrial constructions?
Both, I would say. But then if we so let's say building these factories, then we can see these same conditions as you would see in the construction sector, in people building condos in Stockholm, let's say. But if we think about the migrant workers that come to the factories, to the mines, to the industrial facilities that are opened in the north now, I think there's a lot of difference, because on the one hand, of course, you have often places that are worried about depopulation, both the local residents, but also like local politicians and so on. So for them, this is more of an opportunity or something that can be met with optimism, trying to welcome the workers and wanting to integrate them in the local communities. And I think there's more concern for the welfare of these workers. But on the other hand, of course, the facilities, like the mines, the factories, they are seen often as the source of all of this, right? So in the case of Northvolt with these deaths, for instance, I think we can kind of see this paradox where we have the welcoming of the migrant workers that work in the factory, bringing, a boost to the local economy, etc. But then when it becomes an issue of their security versus the company profits, then of course the company is the institution that is protected in the last instance by the official trade unions and by the local politicians. So I think there's more of a paradox or more of a contradiction.
And what is the attitude in the general public, in the mainstream media, towards these cases of abuse and exploitation?
In the case of the deaths in Northvolt, I think there's a public outrage, actually, because it's been widely reported in national media. And this is part of what's so interesting, because as it's simultaneously a national outrage about the security of the workers, which is, something that affects, on a basic level, I think it affects most people, right? It's a common concern for a lot of us. But then we have the role of the trade union that wants to protect the factory for its own reasons, right? So you have the trade union official condemning the media for even reporting about these deaths. It's a situation that really highlights these political contradictions, let's say, between Swedish social democracy and its trade unions on the one hand, and then public opinions or the interests of the working majority in Sweden on the other.
Viktor, it was a pleasure to have you here. Our listeners can read the Brand magazine by visiting the link in the description. Thanks a lot once again for the conversation.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.